Session. So today we're joined by, and I'll introduce my friends over here. We've got TJ Waterfall, very cool name, TJ. He's the Director of Nutrition at the Game Changers Institute. We have Nicholas Carter, who's also the Director of Environmental Sciences of the Game Changers Institute as well. My name is Robbie Lucky. I'm the founder of a platform called foodfacts.org that I set up in early 2024. Because I got tired of seeing people walking around supermarkets swearing at vegetables, telling their audiences that they're bad for us, and that broccoli contains anti-nutrients and that we shouldn't eat fruits and vegetables. So I became increasingly concerned about the volume of nutrition and food misinformation that I was seeing on social media and also actually in the mainstream media as well. A lot of journalists writing about food and nutrition with no qualifications, spreading misinformation to the general public. So today we're going to talk about misinformation and the effects it has on the public. I've got a clicker here, which see if I can get it working. To start it off, I want to talk about misinformation and disinformation, what these actually mean. The World Economic Forum has said that misinformation is the top threat to humanity above extreme weather. And the reason that is because it delays the necessary behavioral change we need to make as a society in a number of areas, of course, to mitigate some of the worst effects of climate breakdown. Misinformation is information that is spread from person to person, usually by accident. So, your nan might send you a message on WhatsApp, you love your nan, you trust your nan, and she'll then, you'll then send it to friends and family, but you might not check it, you might not fact check it because you've trusted the person who sent it to you, but you are spreading false information by accident, without purpose, without intent. Disinformation, on the other side, is by industry. Industry that creates media, billboards, magazine ads to purposely mislead the public, usually for reasons of profit, most of the time. There are other reasons, but that's one of the major ones. So let's start off with speaking to Nick here about the current state of the food system. Where are we today, Nick, and how did we get here?
So to sum up our food system in a few minutes is very difficult, but I'm going to paint a bit of a picture of the facts that we know. Going back a few decades, about 1960, you had about 8 billion farmed animals across the planet, so quite a bit. But just in that amount of time since then, 50, 60 years, we're now at 80 billion farmed animals a year that are killed for food, right? So that doesn't just come with more animals, but comes with more land, more water, more emissions. And oftentimes that's hidden behind stories we have been told about food, these cultural kind of narratives. You picture the red barn, the lush pasture, the green space. But of course it hides some of the facts of that lush looking pasture used to be a native forest, right? A wetland might have been also there. So I think, we're here at the Blue Earth Summit. We're all about the environment, and we're environmental advocates, and, land and how we use land and what is the biggest use of land. I think it's probably the biggest thing that we should know and care about. So what you can see here is if you were to condense all of the land used from animal agriculture specifically, it uses more land than all of North and South America combined. Right? Agriculture as a whole uses about half of the planet's land, but it's not evenly used. Right? As you can see here in the green, condensed down, that's all the plant foods that we eat. All the fruits, all the vegetables, all the plant proteins. And it actually returns about 80% of all global calories, or about 60% of global protein. So very significant. But reverse, if you look at probably one of the worst foods would be beef. It uses just a disproportionate amount of land, upwards of about 60% of all agricultural land, and it only returns about 2% of calories or 5% of protein. So we have a picture of a dominance of land that I think we need to have these tough conversations. And I know these are not easy conversations to be had, but these are the type of spaces I think that we should be having those conversations too.
So what drives these narratives? How did we get to a state where most of our agricultural land is going towards intensified animal operations? We call them CAFOs in the United States, concentrated animal feedlots, or factory farming, we call them here in the United Kingdom. In the UK, over 86% of meat consumed comes from a factory farm. these are farms that are damaging nature in unprecedented ways. In the United States, it's 98% of meat products consumed are causing damage to the environment. How is it that there is so much damage, but yet we are still racing towards a society where these types of foods are consumed in such excess?
I think we can look to other industries that we've seen that have changed over time. I mean, the meat industry has a very specific PR campaign that works very similar to how smoking happened before. I mean, the awareness of smoking being damaging for health took many years before change happened. Of course, doctors were one of the biggest advocates as well for smoking. So it's not a perfect comparison, but you can see these things with everything from plastics to chemicals and so on. And I think when you think of farms and you think of food, you don't think of a billion-dollar company that is, I mean, if you look at like pork or beef, about 70 or 75% of all the meat packing and slaughter is run by about 4 companies, right? So there's massive consolidation, and that happens over time. And with that consolidation comes power with government, power with lobbying, power with PR campaigns and marketing. And it can really help bolster that story that, you know, we want to hear. We want to feel good about the things that we're doing, and it can help kind of bolster that kind of cultural shield that I think you see with this space.
Thank you, Nick. Let's talk about how we receive our information. Today, in the world where social media dominates every one of our lives, most of us, if you're not on social media, you're probably a very lucky person because we see it everywhere. It consumes hours and hours of our day. But most people today are getting their nutrition advice from TikTok, Instagram, and just generally on social media. And there was a study done recently that showed 78% of nutrition information shared on TikTok was false or completely misleading, often spread by people with no qualifications in nutrition. So, TJ, tell us a little bit about how this misinformation is spreading on social media and how it impacts people's health and, of course, conversations around the food system and ultimately, you know, in Nick's case, the environmental side.
Thank you. It's a really good question. I would say when industry profits are at stake, then the industries that stand to be affected, quite understandably, will do what it takes to defend or uphold their reputation. And like Nick, you touched on the tobacco industry. There's many examples of that happening throughout history. So the tobacco industry is probably the best example, but we've seen it to some extent with the alcohol industry and the sugar industry as well, where there's just a huge amount and growing amount of robust scientific evidence showing the health effects of these foods, to the point where there's real consensus, clear consensus among the scientific community. And the logical play for the industry that stands to be affected by this is just to cast doubt among the general public.
Right.
And that's actually it's a clever and effective play, because the vast majority of the general public don't have the scientific training to critically evaluate any research that they fund and put out, or any messages that they put out through orchestrated PR campaigns. And so the average person, without the scientific training to really assess or evaluate those claims, thinks that there isn't scientific consensus around these topics. They presume that scientists just can't agree on these topics, and so they just maintain the status quo. And so that's clearly what's happening now with the meat industry as well. And were you able to click through to another slide?
Yeah. Which one?
Go forwards. This one.
Yeah.
So I say this is clear what's happening in the meat industry now. These are the results from a systematic review that were published just in June this year. It was by a team of researchers in UFB University in Madrid. And I should point out that this group of researchers had no industry funding, they had no conflicts of interest. But they assessed all of the randomized controlled human trials that assessed the link between red meat consumption and cardiovascular outcomes. And what they found, so just to point out, this is just red meat, so not processed meat, just unprocessed red meat. And it's just looking at cardiovascular outcomes. So things like LDL and HDL cholesterol, inflammation, blood pressure. So it's not looking at other health outcomes like cancer, where there's also an established risk. They found that 66%, so 2/3 of the studies looking at this link between red meat and cardiovascular outcomes were industry funded. Either industry funded or significant conflicts of interest or ties with the meat industry. And that in itself, I wouldn't say it's concerning, but it's interesting. Like, why is the meat industry pouring so much money and resources into funding these studies? But they looked a little closer, and you can see on this bar chart that so 2/3 of the studies were industry funded, 1/3 were completely independent, so without any funding or conflicts of interest. Of the independent studies, nearly 3/4 of them found that red meat was linked with unfavourable cardiovascular outcomes. About a quarter showed neutral effects. When you look at the industry-funded studies, none of those studies found an unfavourable effect of red meat consumption with those cardiovascular outcomes. A vast majority found a neutral effect. Actually, 20% found benefits, surprisingly. And I should point out, a conflict of interest or industry funding shouldn't automatically mean that we disregard the results of a study. I think that's actually quite a lazy critique. Because it's very rare that nutrition scientists will just completely fabricate results. But what it does mean sometimes is that they will design the studies in a way that
For a favourable outcome.
yeah, more likely to lead to favourable outcomes. And actually that's what this group of researchers did. They looked at the studies. So the industry-funded studies were much more likely to compare red meat in these randomized controlled trials to other sources of animal protein or refined carbohydrates. So if you do that, you're much more likely to find a neutral effect. Whereas the independent studies would typically compare red meat with sources of plant protein, in which case red meat would typically fare much worse. And so, yeah, I think this...
So with all this in mind, like, what hope does the consumer have ultimately and how are we supposed to make educated decisions about what we should be eating and the effect it has on our bodies and the environment if industry is constantly pushing certain narratives and driving certain conversations, and then you add politicians and culture wars which pit people against each other. Ultimately, at the end of the day, most people in our countries are just trying to survive, feed their children, pay their bills, do their jobs, and so they are relying heavily on public health information from governments in their day-to-day life, but these messages are being drowned out by people on social media, untrained, self-proclaimed health influencers who have millions of followers, who often create video content that reaches millions of people that says things like, broccoli is bad for you, or oatmeal is not safe to eat because it contains phytic acid. It's all things that for the average person don't make a lot of sense, but what it does is it creates fear. And then you add conversations like ultra-processed food, the fear around like what we're eating, food with large amounts of ingredients. All it does is create more fear. Let's put a pin in that and come back to the environmental side of things. Food in our everyday lives has an effect on the environment. And in fact, ironically, and probably a lot of people here know this, but the general public do not. Let's talk, Nick, a little bit about some of the solutions and some of the conversations here around solutions themselves and this buzzword regenerative that we hear mentioned over and over and over again, and it's getting louder and louder. Are these solutions useful? Are there any merit to them? And what is some of the misinformation when it comes to regenerative farming practices?
So with regenerative, of course, the old word used to be sustainable. You used to always hear about sustainability. That used to be the word. And now it's regenerative. And I think in many ways it is a more accurate label. We want to not just be sustainable and hit the status quo. We want to regenerate over time. But what that means is very vague. And a lot in the food space, what that has come to mean is regenerative agriculture with not tilling the land, maybe diverse crops, a number of different, what would be considered conservation agriculture, perhaps even green manures. I think these are all very solid innovations that I think you should watch the yield and how that changes over time. But I think what you largely see with the regenerative agriculture, and we've seen it a few times today just looking at a few of the talks, is you see integration of cattle or pig and claiming that this is like a necessity. First of all, I think it's important to be very clear. It's a terrible source of food production for meat. You're getting very little meat from this. You're adding methane, and I think the biggest thing about this is you're increasing land significantly. And this has been modeled through studies. So there was a study in the US from researchers Matthew Hayek and Rachel Garrett. And they looked at what would happen if you wanted to meet the demand for beef in the US, switching from a conventional beef model to grass finished, not even so-called regenerative. And they showed that you could meet only 27% of the demand for meat in the US.
Because we just don't have enough land.
There's just not enough land. And so I think ultimately, if you want to talk about regenerative grazing or ways in which you can maybe take animals out of confinement onto land, there's no way you should be having this conversation unless you're first talking about shifting more plant-based or changing more plant-based. And the way in which you can do that is your own diet, or you can do that by being an ally. You can do that by changing our food system and making delicious plant-based meals like there is some offered here, which is amazing. And making that like the default, I think, is the least we can do. And then you're freeing up land. You're freeing up options for land. Say you want to do some experimental ways of grazing cattle. I mean, I don't think it's a good way of doing that. I don't think it's a good source of food production. I don't think it's healthy. There's many things that I don't think, but that's my perspective. I think there's room for many different perspectives. But I think an important thing about the need to change our food system plant-based is it's one of the only things we can do that frees up options. Say you're into like biofuels, or say you want to produce energy on land. You can't do any of that unless you're shifting more plant-based. So I think the land benefits of doing that are very key. There's many other solutions, but that's one of the main ones and related to the topic of regenerative agriculture.
We've got about 10 minutes left, so we're going to do a quick fire question round. TJ, should we be worried about UPFs? You can keep it to under a minute.
I can try. UPFs, ultra-processed foods, for anyone who's not sure. I think there's some merit to thinking about ultra-processed foods. I think everyone would benefit from more home-cooked foods, but it can be a distraction from what is really important, which is the fat, salt, and sugar content of foods. And of course, those can all be high in ultra-processed foods, but not all ultra-processed foods. And many single ingredient foods, like butter, isn't classed as an ultra-processed food that has clear detrimental effects on health because it's so high in total unsaturated fat.
Thank you. Nick, is buying local an environmental solution in every case?
I mean, I used to think so. That was one of the first things I thought going into this space. Ultimately, what the data shows is buying local food makes up about 1% when it comes to beef to maximum 10%
of emissions.
Of emissions. So it's not like a major factor. The most important thing for food is what you're eating, the deforestation involved, and the methane emissions. So in that case, more plant-based is the better option. Of course, there's other benefits of eating local. I mean, I have a garden at home. You can increase food resiliency. You learn about food. I mean, there's lots of cool things. But environment-wise, it's not a big metric.
So put your hands up if you've heard that consuming soy products contain estrogen. Right, there we go. So TJ, tell us, should we be eating soy or not?
I think soy is an incredible health food based on the literature.
But why do people believe it has estrogen in it?
That's a common misconception. Early studies from 20, 30 years ago conducted in rodents found that feeding those rodents megadoses of soy isoflavones, which are the phytoestrogens in soy, led to decreased testosterone and increased estrogen in those rats. But humans metabolize isoflavones very differently to rodents, and they use megadoses that would be almost impossible to consume in a normal diet. And so we've got multiple randomized controlled human trials now, and a meta-analysis, so a big analysis of the entire literature landscape, showing that in human randomized controlled trials, soy and isoflavones don't affect testosterone or estrogen in men, and that's regardless of dose and study duration. So It's very safe.
Yeah, have a conversation with people who live in Asia who've been consuming soy products for thousands of years, And many of the leading killers of human beings in the Western world today are not at the same levels as they are in Asia. And there's a long conversation about that. But back to you, Nick. Is changing food systems as important as addressing fossil fuels?
I think they're both very important, but I think when it comes to biodiversity, land use, water use, eutrophication, runoff into oceans, I mean, the biodiversity in the ocean, I mean, about 55% of the ocean is considered to be used for fishing, according to IPBES. It's an international panel on biodiversity. So, yeah, across more broad environmental metrics, I would say food is the number one thing we should be changing. And fossil fuels, of course, are a big issue too.
Going back to you, TJ, when it comes to protein, we are living in a society absolutely obsessed with protein. If you look around you, you will not see another human being who is protein deficient. We're all eating more than enough protein. In fact, many people are eating far too much protein. There is a narrative that you will see on social media, you'll see in the mainstream media, that protein from plant sources is not complete and that it is an inferior source of protein. Put your hands up if you've heard that. Right? TJ, do you want to take away some myth busting to this bit of information?
Yeah, historically people were worried about, like you said, whether you can get enough protein from plants, total protein. That's clearly been shown to be very easy, straightforward. Like you said, you never really see anyone with protein deficiency in the Western world. Studies have shown that on average, people eating plant-based diets have 27% over the recommended daily allowance of protein. And even people consuming an omnivorous diet get over half their protein from plants. So the shift now has moved on to the quality of that protein. And kind of mechanistically, it kind of makes sense that you would think that plant protein might be inferior because meat, for example, is much higher in the amino acid leucine, which is important for triggering muscle protein synthesis, for example. All plants contain all 20 amino acids, but most plants have a slightly lower proportion of one or two of those amino acids. So on paper, mechanistically, there's theories that the plant protein might be inferior. But what really matters is outcomes in human randomized controlled trials. And there's a couple that have come out recently where groups are given an omnivorous diet and a entirely plant-based diet, and they conduct a 10 or 12-week experiment where they're resistance training, and the outcome is there's no difference in muscle size or strength over those 10 to 12-week training periods, as long as people are consuming an adequate amount of total protein. So when total protein intake is sufficient, then the source of that protein, whether it's coming from animals or plants, doesn't seem to make any difference.
So get some tofu and tempeh and what else?
Yeah, I mean, there's protein in everything.
Right. Can I just cut in there? Because I think there's a lack of understanding just from the public that all protein originates in plants. You know, the animals that we eat in our society, they get their protein from plants, and then obviously we consume the animal. As Nick pointed out, you may have missed it, when you consume beef, for example, for every 100 calories you feed a cow, you get 1 calorie back in meat. So, when you look at the way our food is processed and the way we get our calories, we do have to be pragmatic. This isn't a conversation about whether you should be vegan or not. We all want people to make decisions based on how their lives are arranged. But this conversation is very much about the information that we are receiving on a daily basis through the various channels that we have at our disposal. And it's very important that the public are being protected from misinformation, because if we are being constantly exposed to the incorrect information about food and nutrition, how are we supposed to make decisions about what we eat that benefit ourselves, our communities, and the planet at large? Last question to you, Nick. Sorry, my notes have gone off. Does a shift towards a more plant-centric food system mean monocultures and increased industrialized farming?
I think this is like one of those binary things that are kind of pushed on social media that you see. You see like this kind of lush pasture, or you see monoculture, and you think that monoculture means plant-based. But oftentimes that monoculture of the same crop is for feeding the animals. right? And of course there is some, but I mean, ultimately what you have is more protein, more nutrients, and more calories produced on a smaller amount of land with plants. And you're not cycling it through an animal, getting upwards of about 90% of a calorie loss when you do that. So I think when people think of eating more plant-based, you should be seeing the rewilded areas that you're freeing up. You should be seeing the native forests, the native animals, because that's what you really are allowing to happen, or the abundance of other options you want to do with that land. I mean, we're in London. This is an area of an immense privilege. And of course, it's a very difficult thing to change diet. Diet's personal. Diet's like, you're eating what your grandmother cooked in recipes. But of course, like, rich countries need to be the ones leading the change. And I think we should be taking that kind of privilege that we have and doing something good with it, and not being afraid of these kind of big changes that we should see.
Right. Thank you, Nick. I think we've got time for a couple of questions. Has anyone in the audience got a question for Nick or TJ?
There should be a mic coming to you.
Glad you're here.
Hi. There are a few things that we agree on. I absolutely agree with you that diets need to change, and I agree that we should be moving completely away from industrial livestock systems, and that will mean eating considerably less meat. But I just want to offer a different perspective on this, which is that I think if we're going to move to truly regenerative, truly agroecological systems that don't rely on the use of agrochemicals, I don't really see a future in which that doesn't involve grazing livestock, at least to a certain extent, as part of lower input pasture-based systems. And I guess my perspective on this is that diet should be informed by what the land can sustainably produce. And if you were to turn all of the grass, I think 2/3 of the UK roughly is grassland, if we were to completely plough that up to grow crops, we'd be releasing a huge amount of carbon. And my thoughts on this are that there is an alternative to everything that you've just shared, which is that we should be eating much, much less, but better quality meat and dairy from truly agroecological systems that don't rely on chemicals. And I'd love your perspective on that.
Nick, that's for you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think the complex thing is we should allow varying perspectives on this topic. I don't necessarily agree with that, because the idea that taking confined animals and then putting them out on pasture, you emit more methane and you use more land. Now, of course, you share the most important part there, which is that we first should be looking at less meat, less dairy, and then we can think about those things. I think the problem I see in kind of looking at this environmental topic is I see a lot of people pushing for the better meat story, and then we forget about that first step that is absolutely crucial to even consider the idea of extensively raising animals. And I mean, I think if you look at the environmental literature, it's very clear that there's a reason groups like the Food and Agriculture Organization have been pushing for intensification, and that's just a fancy way of saying factory farms. It's because you produce more meat on less land, and you produce a lot of it. Now, it's horrible. There's horrible conditions. I think there's been some good surveys that show that people don't support factory farms. But I think that first step is so important of showing another story. There's another story of more plants. And I mean, there's a few other points you mentioned there too. I mean, in the UK, for example, you wouldn't be plowing up that land. You'd be losing far, far less land. And you could allow so much areas to rewild, and you could produce more food on less land instead of relying on pasture and grazing.
I just want to throw a stat in there. For a person to eat a plant-based diet, we would require 18 times less land agriculturally. That 80% of the agricultural land in our country right now is going towards animal agriculture. So farming the animals, housing the animals, the plants that we grow to feed the animals. So yeah, we have to find a place in the middle. I'd love to chat to you afterwards, because that's where the agroecologists and the more plant-based conversations need to come together, because there's many places for agreement. But I think we are out of time, aren't we? So we'll wrap things up there. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.